Have you ever stopped to think that despite being one of the things we pursue most in life, pleasure has never been the topic of a school lesson? I spent 12 years sitting in a classroom, but not even the most daring teacher came close to discussing this subject. For some reason, it was never part of the curriculum. Why? The truth is, pleasure seems to be seen as a taboo topic in formal education. And that's curious because if there's something that influences our daily choices, from what we eat to what we do in our free time, it's pleasure. But it's as if this topic is sidelined, considered something minor, unimportant. Schools focus on what we need to know to survive, but not on what makes us feel alive. What's even more intriguing is that when I started studying philosophy, I discovered that pleasure is not only important, but it's the central focus of one of the main philosophical schools, hedonism. But there's a catch. Hedonism is one of the most misunderstood philosophies of all time. When we think of hedonism, the image that comes to mind is of someone immersed in luxury, partying, and without limits. The truth is that hedonism, at its core, is about balance and moderation. This is what many people don't understand. Pleasure, according to the hedonists, isn't about excess, but about knowing how to enjoy what life offers in a balanced way. And that completely changes how we view this philosophy. Original hedonism, which began with the Greeks, is much deeper and more philosophical than it seems. Pleasure isn't just a whim or an indulgence, it's a fundamental part of what it means to be human. And that's precisely why it needs to be understood in all its complexity. When we talk about pleasure and hedonism, it's impossible not to mention Epicurus, the Greek philosopher who dedicated much of his life to understanding what it truly means to live a pleasurable life. Now, the reputation he had in his time, and which still persists today, was that of someone who sought uncontrolled pleasures. He was even nicknamed the Pig, and many thought he advocated a life without restraints, where pleasure was the only thing that mattered. But the truth is that this is one of the greatest myths in philosophy. In reality, Epicurus advocated something very different. For him, the most valuable pleasure was simple and sustainable pleasure. He believed that to truly live well, we needed to learn to find pleasure in the most accessible, everyday things. A simple meal, the company of good friends, a moment of peace in nature. These were, for Epicurus, the true sources of pleasure. And there's a very practical reason for this. If you can only feel pleasure with rare and sophisticated things, your life will become a constant search for something that's not always within reach. But if you learn to find pleasure in what's always available, then pleasure becomes constant. A classic example he used was that of a simple breeze. Something so common, so present, can be a source of pleasure if you know how to appreciate it. And here lies the central point of Epicurus's philosophy. For pleasure to be truly pleasurable, it can't depend on special or rare conditions, because if it does, you're doomed to spend more time in frustration than in satisfaction. Epicurus saw moderation as the key to a happy life. For him, living with balance was the smartest way to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. Here's the trick. Contrary to what many think, Epicurus didn't advocate that we should seek pleasure at all costs. He believed that true pleasure comes from a simple and moderate life. So, Epicurean hedonism is much more about finding joy in the small things than living a life of excess. Now, let's delve into one of the classic distinctions in philosophy, the difference between bodily pleasures and spiritual pleasures. Since antiquity, philosophers have debated this division. Plato, for example, already spoke about the superiority of the pleasures of the spirit over those of the body. This distinction continued throughout the centuries, with thinkers like John Stuart Mill reinforcing this idea. So, what exactly are these pleasures? Bodily pleasures are immediate and physical. A simple example: when you're hungry and eat something delicious. That's a bodily pleasure, stemming from the satisfaction of a biological need. Spiritual pleasures, on the other hand, are subtler and require more intellectual effort. Things like reading a profound book, contemplating a work of art, or reflecting on life fall into this category. Why is this distinction important? Well, bodily pleasures, despite being intense, are fleeting. They rely on a prior lack to be truly pleasurable. You only feel pleasure drinking water when you're thirsty or eating when you're hungry. This means that bodily pleasure has a limited duration. Once the need is met, the pleasure ends. Spiritual pleasures, on the other hand, can be cultivated over time without depending on a physical need. But then comes the dilemma. If bodily pleasures are more intense, why aren't they enough to bring us lasting happiness? The answer lies in their brevity. They may be great in the moment, but they can't sustain a long-term sense of well-being. That's why many philosophers, including Epicurus, believed that spiritual pleasures were superior. They're less intense, but also less volatile. The main point is that bodily pleasures, while necessary, cannot be the center of our lives. They must be balanced with spiritual pleasures, which offer us deeper and more lasting satisfaction. It's not that one is better than the other, but we need to understand the role each plays in our pursuit of happiness. Pleasures like a good meal or even an orgasm can be incredibly intense, but they don't last long. And what comes afterward? Often what remains is a certain emptiness, a feeling that it all passed too quickly. Then the search for the next moment of pleasure begins. This is the big trap of bodily pleasures. They're always associated with a prior lack. You only feel pleasure drinking water when you're really thirsty. The greater the lack, the more intense the pleasure. But this creates a problematic cycle. To keep feeling the same pleasure, you need to go through periods of deprivation, which aren't always pleasant. An interesting example of this is tantric sex, which is often mentioned as a way to prolong pleasure by delaying satisfaction. The idea is that the longer you wait, the more intense the final pleasure will be. But this expectation can become a kind of torture, and the relationship between lack and pleasure becomes a delicate equation. Additionally, the fleeting nature of these pleasures leaves us always wanting more. It's like an endless cycle. You feel pleasure, it passes quickly, and soon you're searching for the next. This explains why many of us seek increasingly intense forms of pleasure, whether in food, experiences, or other stimuli. But is this cycle healthy? The reflection here is that if our lives are focused solely on these immediate pleasures, we're always at the mercy of lack and the need for repetition. That's why, although these pleasures are important, they need to be balanced with something more lasting and meaningful, like spiritual pleasures. Another problem related to bodily pleasures is excessive sophistication. We live in a world where we're always seeking the next, most intense, most expensive, most elaborate pleasure. But this ends up creating a side effect, the loss of sensitivity to simpler pleasures. A classic example? Food. If you're used to eating super elaborate dishes, at some point, the basics, like rice and beans, seem bland. And this applies to any type of pleasure. If you're always seeking the most luxurious experience, the most expensive or rare version of something, you begin to lose the ability to feel pleasure in what's common. This creates a kind of tolerance to pleasure, where you need increasingly greater stimuli to feel the same thing. Epicurus already talked about this. He warned that the more sophisticated your pleasures, the harder it will be to find them consistently. And this puts you in a vulnerable position where pleasure becomes scarce. After all, how often will you have access to that expensive wine or that exotic trip? And when sophistication becomes the norm, what's left to satisfy us in our daily lives? The philosophy of Epicurus, like that of other thinkers, has always been to value what is at hand, what is simple and accessible. Because these are the pleasures that can be repeated throughout life without creating dependency or frustration. When you begin to appreciate simpler things, like plain rice or a walk in the park, pleasure becomes something sustainable. The idea here is that the more sophisticated your tastes, the harder it will be to find satisfaction in everyday things. This can end up impoverishing your life, leaving you dependent on rare and distant moments. But if you can find pleasure in what is simple, then you're always in control of your own happiness. And here we arrive at the final reflection. In the end, the secret to pleasure doesn't lie in seeking something rare or extraordinary, but in appreciating what's already around us. How many times have we failed to value the little things, waiting for great moments that never seem to come? The truth is, pleasure can be found in the simplest things. The taste of homemade food, the breeze on your face, a good conversation with friends. What Epicurus teaches us is that the simpler the pleasure, the more it can be repeated, and the less we're at the mercy of scarcity. Life doesn't need to be an endless pursuit of unattainable pleasures, but a constant practice of finding happiness in the small things. Sophistication can be a trap, distancing us from the true richness that lies in accessible experiences, in the now. So, here's the challenge. Next time you seek pleasure, ask yourself if you're looking for what's simple, or if you're waiting for something that may never come. The key to living well isn't having the most intense pleasure, but the most consistent one. Because in the end, true freedom is knowing that you can find pleasure anywhere, at any time. As Epicurus would say, happiness isn't in what's scarce, but in the art of knowing how to enjoy what's always within reach. And remember, knowledge is the path to true freedom. Count on me and follow the white rabbit.